He wasn't cruel. He wasn't emotionally absent in obvious ways. But loving him slowly made me doubt myself. I didn't fall for him because he was passionate, or intense, or overwhelming in the way people warn you about. I fell for him because he felt safe. He was calm, predictable, kind in a quiet, almost invisible way. There were no dramatic gestures, no late-night confessions, no promises that sounded too good to be true. And at first, that felt like maturity. I remember thinking, this is what healthy love must look like. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't disappear for days. He didn't flirt with other women in front of me. When I talked about my day, he listened. When I was tired, he didn't complain. When I needed space, he respected it. On paper, there was nothing to question. And because of that, I never questioned anything. Not in the beginning. The first signs weren't signs at all. They were absences so small they felt accidental. Like the way he rarely asked follow-up questions, or how conversations ended exactly where I left them. I would say, I've been feeling a little overwhelmed lately. And he would nod, say, that makes sense. Then change the subject. At first I told myself he just wasn't good with emotions. Some people aren't. I didn't want to be the kind of person who expected someone to read my mind. So I filled in the gaps myself. When he didn't ask how I was really doing, I told myself he trusted that I would tell him if it mattered. When he didn't notice I was quieter than usual, I told myself I was just tired. When he didn't sense the distance growing inside me, I told myself maybe there was no distance at all. Love, I believed, didn't have to be intense to be real. It just had to be steady, and he was steady. He showed up on time, he answered texts, he kept his word. So whenever a small ache surfaced, I pushed it down. Because how could I complain about something that wasn't wrong? There was no moment where I felt unloved. Not exactly. It was more like feeling unattended. Like a room that was clean and quiet, but no one ever opened the windows. I remember one night, lying next to him in bed, staring at the ceiling while he slept. He had his back turned to me. Not intentionally, just naturally. His breathing was slow and even, peaceful. I wanted to tell him something, nothing dramatic, just that I had felt invisible all day. But the words stayed in my throat, not because I was afraid of his reaction. He wouldn't react badly. That was the problem. He wouldn't react much at all. So I stayed quiet, and in that silence, something subtle happened. I began editing myself. I stopped bringing up things that felt heavy. I chose lighter topics, safer thoughts. If a feeling didn't sound reasonable, I didn't say it. If it couldn't be explained clearly, I swallowed it. Because I didn't want to be confusing, or emotional, or too much. He never told me I was too much. He didn't have to. The space between us did that work for him. When I laughed, he smiled. When I cried, he offered solutions. He was never cruel, never dismissive, just distant in a way that was easy to excuse. He cared, but quietly. He loved, but carefully. And I adapted. I learned to match his emotional volume. If he spoke in short sentences, I shortened mine. If he didn't share deeply, I didn't ask him to. I told myself relationships were about compromise. So I compromised on myself. Little by little, there was a moment early on when I almost noticed. We were at dinner with friends. Everyone was laughing, sharing stories. Someone asked me a question about my work, something I was passionate about. I started answering, animated, excited. Halfway through, I glanced at him. He was listening, but not leaning in, not curious, not engaged, just present. His eyes drifted toward his plate, then toward the room. Nothing rude, nothing obvious, but something in me dimmed. I finished my sentence quickly, changed the topic. Later that night, he said, "You seemed quiet at dinner." I laughed and said, "Oh, it was nothing." And I meant it, because by then I'd learned how to make my feelings small enough to disappear. There was no fight to mark the beginning of the end, no argument I could point to, just a slow rearranging of myself around him. I became easier, more agreeable, less expressive, and I was proud of that. I told myself I was being mature, understanding, low maintenance. I admired how calm our relationship felt compared to others. No chaos, no drama, but also no depth that reached me. I didn't realize yet that something was being taken from me. Because nothing was being forcefully removed, I was giving it away, one quiet moment at a time. I remember telling a friend, "He's a good man, I'm lucky." And she nodded. Because from the outside, it looked like love. There were pictures of us smiling, shared routines, inside jokes, but there were also conversations I rehearsed in my head and never had. Questions I answered for him. Needs I downgraded. I stopped expecting him to notice when I was hurting. Instead, I focused on being easy to love. And the quieter I became, the calmer everything felt, which felt like success. I didn't know then that peace and emotional neglect can look very similar. I didn't know that the absence of conflict can sometimes mean the absence of connection. I thought love was supposed to feel safe. I didn't realize safe shouldn't feel empty. Not yet. That understanding would come later. For now, I was still convincing myself that this was enough, that I was enough, that nothing was missing, even as I slowly stopped asking myself what I needed. At some point, I stopped waiting for him to change, not because I had accepted things as they were, but because I had started changing instead. It didn't happen all at once. There was no clear decision, no moment where I said, "From now on, I'll be smaller." It was more like a series of quiet conclusions. If he didn't respond emotionally, it must be because I was asking in the wrong way. If he seemed distant when I shared something important, it must be because I hadn't explained it clearly enough. If he didn't notice when I was hurting, maybe I wasn't hurting badly enough to deserve attention. That's how it started. Not with anger toward him, but with suspicion toward myself. I began replaying conversations in my head after they ended. Not to understand him, but to analyze myself. Did my tone sound needy? Did I talk too long? Was I expecting too much from a simple moment? I would remember the look on his face when I spoke. Calm, neutral, almost blank. And instead of wondering what he felt, I wondered what I had done wrong. I told myself he was just emotionally reserved, logical, practical. Some people, I believed, simply didn't speak the language of feelings fluently. So I tried to translate myself into something he could understand. I softened my words, removed emotion from my sentences. Instead of saying, "I feel lonely when you don't ask about my day," I said, "I know you're busy." Instead of saying, "I need more emotional closeness," I said, "It's fine." And every time I did that, he seemed more comfortable, which I took as proof that I was doing something right. I mistook his comfort for connection. Slowly, I stopped checking in with my own feelings. Whenever something hurt, my first instinct was no longer to feel it. It was to evaluate it. Was this reasonable? Was this justified? Would someone else feel this way? If the answer wasn't immediately clear, I dismissed the feeling altogether. I told myself I was becoming more rational, more mature, but what I was really becoming was detached from myself. There were days when I felt heavy for no obvious reason. Nothing had happened. No argument, no disappointment I could point to. Just a quiet sadness that followed me around. Instead of asking why, I told myself I was being dramatic. I told myself other people had it worse. He wasn't abusive. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't unfaithful. So what right did I have to feel this way? That question became a wall I couldn't climb over. Because there was no visible injury, only an absence. And how do you justify pain caused by what isn't there? I started apologizing more, not out loud, but internally. I apologized for my moods, for my sensitivity, for needing reassurance. Every time I wanted to reach for him emotionally, I stopped myself. I didn't want to burden him. I didn't want to create tension. I didn't want to be the reason something felt off. So I swallowed my needs before they ever became requests. And over time, I forgot what I would have asked for anyway. I remember once, sitting across from him, wanting to tell him that I felt disconnected. The words formed in my head. But before they reached my mouth, another voice interrupted. What if you're just overthinking? What if you ruin a good thing by making it complicated? So I smiled instead, asked him about his day, and listened. I became very good at listening. I listened to his stories, his frustrations, his thoughts. I offered support, advice, understanding, and I meant it. I cared deeply. But somewhere along the way, I stopped expecting the same in return. Not because he refused to give it, but because I no longer believed I deserved it. That belief didn't arrive suddenly. It settled in slowly. Like dust you don't notice until everything feels dull. I began measuring myself against an invisible standard. The standard of being easy. Easy to be with. Easy to love. Easy to understand. If I could be easy enough, maybe he would lean in more. Maybe he would ask deeper questions. Maybe he would notice. But no matter how carefully I shaped myself, the distance remained. And instead of questioning the distance, I questioned my shape. I wondered if I was inherently difficult, too emotional, too complex. I compared myself to women who seemed effortlessly calm, who didn't need to talk things through. I told myself I should be more like them, quieter, less intense, more self-contained. I started editing my reactions in real time. If something hurt, I paused before responding. I asked myself whether reacting would make sense to him. If the answer was no, I chose silence. I learned how to look fine even when I wasn't. I perfected neutral expressions, soft smiles. I became skilled at saying, "I'm okay," in a way that sounded convincing. Eventually, it started convincing me too. There was a strange safety in blaming myself. Because if the problem was me, then the relationship could still be good. Fixable, I could adjust, improve, grow. Admitting that the relationship itself was lacking felt more dangerous. That would mean acknowledging a loss I didn't know how to grieve. So I stayed focused inward. Every unmet need became a flaw. Every unreturned emotion became a misunderstanding. I told myself love wasn't supposed to be intense. That intensity was immature, unrealistic. I prided myself on not needing much, but needing less didn't make me happier. It made me smaller. I noticed changes in how I spoke to others too. With friends, I hesitated before sharing anything heavy. I didn't want to sound like I was complaining. I didn't want to admit that something felt wrong in a relationship that looked right. So I kept things light, surface level, even with people who knew me well. It was easier to pretend I was fine than to explain something I couldn't fully articulate. Because how do you explain a hurt that has no sharp edges? I often felt like I was standing outside myself, observing, watching someone who was trying very hard to be okay, trying very hard to be low maintenance, trying very hard not to need. And the more I succeeded at that, the more distant I felt from the person I used to be. I remembered being expressive once, passionate, curious, emotionally open. I remembered having strong opinions, strong reactions. Now everything felt muted, as if someone had turned the volume down on my inner world, and I told myself that was growth. That was adulthood. That was love without drama. But sometimes, late at night, when there was nothing to distract me, I felt a quiet panic. A question surfaced that I didn't know how to answer. When was the last time I felt truly seen? Not acknowledged, not agreed with, seen. The answer never came, and instead of sitting with that discomfort, I pushed it away. I told myself I was asking for too much, that expecting someone to meet me emotionally was unrealistic, that no one could fully understand another person anyway. Those thoughts felt mature, reasonable. They helped me stay. They helped me endure. But they also slowly taught me to distrust my own feelings. Every emotion was put on trial. Every need had to be justified. And most of them were found guilty of being excessive. I remember one moment clearly. We were sitting together, not talking, just sharing space. He was on his phone. I was staring out at the window. I felt a wave of loneliness so strong it surprised me. Not the kind that makes you want to cry, the kind that makes you feel hollow. I almost said something, almost reached for him, but then the familiar thoughts returned. He's here, isn't he? Why isn't that enough? So I stayed quiet, and in that silence I realized something frightening. I didn't trust my own loneliness anymore. I didn't believe it was valid. I believed it was a flaw. That realization didn't break me. It didn't lead to tears or confrontation. It just settled in, quietly, like everything else. I began to doubt my instincts. If something felt wrong, I assumed my perception was off. If I felt disconnected, I assumed I was expecting too much connection. If I felt unseen, I assumed visibility was something I hadn't earned yet. I started asking myself how to be better instead of asking whether this was right. I thought if I could just fix myself, everything would align. But no matter how much I adjusted, the emptiness stayed. And the longer it stayed, the more convinced I became that it belonged to me. Not the relationship, not the dynamic. Me. That belief was subtle, but powerful. It shaped the way I moved through the world. I stopped trusting my emotional reactions. I stopped honoring my discomfort. I stopped listening to the quiet voice inside me that whispered, "Something is missing." Because I had trained myself not to listen. Because listening had never changed anything. And so I learned to doubt. My feelings, my needs, my sense of reality. Loving him didn't hurt in obvious ways. It didn't leave marks. But it slowly taught me to turn against myself. and I didn't even realize that was happening. Not yet. The realization didn't arrive like a storm. There was no argument that finally exposed everything, no confession, no betrayal. Nothing broke loudly enough for me to point at and say, "This is where it ended." Instead, it arrived quietly. So quietly that I almost missed it. It began as a sense of fatigue I couldn't sleep off. I was tired even on days when nothing happened. Tired of explaining myself in my head. Tired of rehearsing conversations I never had. Tired of being calm. I noticed it one morning while getting ready for the day. I stood in front of the mirror, brushing my hair, and for a brief moment, I didn't recognize the person looking back at me. Not because I looked different, but because I felt unfamiliar to myself. There was something distant in my eyes, something careful, as if I was constantly monitoring myself. Even when I was alone, that was the first time I asked a question I'd been avoiding. When did I start living like this? Not when did the relationship change. Not when did he change. When did I change? I couldn't answer it right away. The days continued as they always had. We shared meals. We talked about practical things. We coexisted peacefully. From the outside, nothing was wrong. And yet, something in me had stopped reaching. I didn't long for closeness anymore. I didn't feel disappointed when it didn't happen. I felt numb, and that scared me more than loneliness ever had. Loneliness still means you want something. Numbness means you've stopped believing it's possible. I realized I no longer imagined a future where I felt deeply known. Not with him, not with anyone. I had lowered my expectations so thoroughly that I forgot they were ever higher. That thought lingered with me. It followed me through mundane moments, while washing dishes, while walking to work, while listening to him talk about his day. I wasn't unhappy, but I wasn't present either. I felt like a guest in my own life. One evening, we sat together on the couch. He was scrolling through his phone. I was staring at the wall. The silence between us was familiar, comfortable even. And suddenly, without warning, I thought, if this is what the rest of my life feels like, can I do this forever? The question didn't come with panic. It came with clarity. I didn't feel angry at him. I didn't feel betrayed. I felt honest. For the first time in a long while, I didn't argue with my own thought. I didn't explain it away. I let it exist, and in that moment, I understood something important. I wasn't staying because I was happy. I was staying because leaving would require me to admit how much of myself I had lost. That admission felt heavier than the loneliness I knew. So I had chosen the familiar pain over the unknown truth. That night, I lay in bed, awake, listening to his breathing. The same position as before, his back turned toward me. But this time, I wasn't waiting for him to turn around. I wasn't hoping for a sign. I was observing myself, and I noticed something profound. I felt no urge to reach out, not because I didn't care, but because I had learned that reaching didn't lead anywhere. That realization didn't make me cry. It made me quiet. In the days that followed, I started paying attention, not to him, to myself. I noticed how tense my body felt during conversations, how I chose my words carefully, even when talking about neutral things, how I smiled out of habit, how I agreed quickly. I noticed how rarely I spoke about my inner world and how automatic it felt to keep it hidden. I had been so focused on being understood that I forgot what it felt like to understand myself. So I began asking small questions. questions I hadn't allowed myself to ask before. What do I feel right now? What do I want to say but won't? What am I afraid would happen if I did? The answers weren't dramatic. They were simple. I want to feel met. I want to feel chosen emotionally. I want to feel like my presence changes something. Those wants didn't feel unreasonable. They felt human. And for the first time, I didn't label them as flaws. That shift was subtle, but it changed everything. I stopped trying to justify my emptiness. I stopped measuring my pain against imaginary standards. I allowed myself to acknowledge something quietly true. This relationship had required me to disappear, not because he demanded it, but because the space he offered couldn't hold me. And instead of leaving that space, I had shrunk to fit it. That wasn't his crime, but it was my loss. Once I saw that clearly, I couldn't unsee it. Every interaction felt different, not worse, just clearer. When he listened without curiosity, I noticed. When he responded without depth, I felt it. And for the first time, I didn't translate his absence into self-blame. I didn't ask what I could do better. I asked whether this was enough for me. That question didn't demand an immediate answer. It just existed, patiently. I didn't confront him right away. There was nothing to accuse him of. He hadn't lied. He hadn't mistreated me. He had loved me in the way he knew how. The problem was that I had accepted a love that required me to be less than myself, and I had done it quietly. So quietly that even I didn't notice for a long time. The realization didn't make me want to leave instantly. It made me want to return to myself. I started doing small things differently. I spoke a little more honestly, not dramatically, just truthfully. If I felt tired, I said I was tired. If something mattered to me, I didn't downplay it immediately. I watched how it landed, not to test him, but to observe. And what I observed was simple. The dynamic didn't change. He didn't lean in more. He didn't pull away either. He stayed exactly the same, and for the first time, I didn't interpret that as a reflection of my worth. I interpreted it as information I'd been ignoring. I realized that love doesn't have to hurt to be wrong for you. Sometimes it just doesn't meet you where you are. And staying in that space slowly teaches you to abandon parts of yourself. That was the truth I'd been circling around for months, maybe longer. One afternoon, I sat alone in a cafe, watching people pass by, couples talking, laughing, arguing softly. I noticed something I hadn't noticed before. The couples who felt alive weren't perfect. They were responsive. They affected each other. Their presence mattered, and I realized how long it had been since I felt like my emotional presence mattered to anyone, including myself. That realization didn't come with jealousy. It came with grief. Grief for the parts of me that had gone quiet. Grief for the woman I used to be before she learned to doubt herself. I let myself feel that grief. I didn't rush past it. I didn't minimize it. I sat with it. And in that space, something gentle happened. Compassion. Not for him, for me. I saw how hard I had tried, how patient I had been, how willing I was to adapt. And instead of criticizing myself for staying too long, I thanked myself for surviving the way I knew how. I had done what I thought love required. Now I knew better. That knowledge didn't demand immediate action. It just changed the way I held myself. I stood a little straighter. I trusted my feelings a little more. I stopped dismissing discomfort as immaturity. I stopped calling my needs excessive. I began to see them as signals, not demands, signals pointing me back to myself. When the time came to leave, it didn't feel like escape. It felt like alignment, but that moment wasn't dramatic either. There was no explosive goodbye, just a quiet understanding. This isn't where I grow. This isn't where I'm seen. This isn't where I can be fully alive. And that was enough. Looking back, I don't think he ever meant to make me doubt myself. But intent doesn't erase impact. And love that requires self-erasure, even unintentionally, is not love that sustains you. I learned something important from that relationship. Emotional neglect doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers. It convinces you that you're asking for too much when you're really just asking the wrong person. It teaches you to mistrust your inner voice until you forget it was ever there. And healing doesn't come from blaming the other person. It comes from listening again. Listening to the quiet truth inside you, the one that never stopped knowing. I didn't leave because he was cruel. I left because I was disappearing. And choosing myself didn't feel like triumph. It felt like relief. A soft, steady relief. Like finally exhaling after holding my breath for too long. I wasn't broken. I wasn't too much. I wasn't wrong for wanting more. I was simply in a place that couldn't meet me. And now I know the difference.